At the end of 1759, the Prussian military situation seemed hopeless. They were severely outnumbered on several different fronts. As Frederick wrote to his brother Henry, "Our situation is abominable. My heart is eaten away by sorrow. What depresses me most of all is the knowledge that I have come to the end of my resources. We have nothing left. I do not wish to plunge you into gloom on this New Year's Day, but I have to speak frankly, and this terrible prospect is evident to all who do not shut their eyes to it." The Battle of Maxen had been a disaster for the Prussians, with only returning 3,000 of the 15,000 troops. The Austrian countess wrote to the court in Vienna, "The King of Prussia is as good as destroyed, and the English financial strength is exhausted." The financial state of the Prussian kingdom was in complete decline. Frederick was forced to debase the currency, which briefly helped his short-term problem, though it did cause inflation. A personal note written by Frederick stated, "I do not know whether I shall survive this war, but I am firmly resolved in this case, this happens to spend the rest of my days in seclusion, in the bosom of philosophy and friendship." In the winter of 1759, Frederick sent lavish gifts to the court of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, though the gifts did not result in anything other than a brief diplomatic meeting. The Ottomans had no interest in involving themselves in a war against the Habsburgs. Frederick would now have to achieve his victory alone. The Prussian total strength now equaled about 1,100,000 men, much fewer than the year prior. Frederick looked to recapture the Silesian capital of Breslau, as well as parts of Saxony, not currently under Prussian occupation. General Loudon of the Habsburg army sought to engage the small army under the command of General Matthieu Foch at Landshut on June 23, 1760. A Prussian army of 12,000 men under General Heydrich August de Montlefoux fought an Austrian army of over 28,000 men under Ernst Guyden von Loudon and suffered a devastating defeat, with its commander wounded and taken prisoner. The Prussians lost around 10,000 men. The Austrians lost only around 1,000 men. The Prussians fought with resolution, surrendering after running out of ammunition. After the loss at Landshut, Frederick was surrounded by three different Austrian armies, one under Lacy, one under Daun, and another under the newly victorious Loudon. Frederick made attempts to evade the Austrians and cross the Kitzbühel and march to Breslau, but he was unable to do so. On August 14th, the Prussians were encamped on the heights to the west of the town of Lechnig, overlooking the Kochbach. Frederick made the decision to abandon his attempt to cross the Kochbach in that area to march down the northern left bank of the Kochbach to the town of Parchwitz, near its confluence with the Oder River, in attempt at crossing. The Prussian army began the march on the night of August the 14th, 1760. As was so frequently the practice, the Prussians left their campfires burning to mask the moves. The Prussian piquets remained in place to prevent any early discovery of the ruse. A drunken Irish officer, Captain Wise, had been dismissed from the Austrian service, arrived in the Prussian camp, and warned Frederick that the Austrian army was on the move to attack him. Daun's elaborate plan required Loudon's force, with 24,000 men, approximately the same size as the Prussian army, to cross the Kotzebue to the east of Lechnik and cut off Frederick's escape route, while Daun would cross the Kotzebue in the area of Daunu and attack the Prussian camp. A further force commanded by General Lacy was to circle round from the north and attack the Prussian camp in the rear, cutting off any retreat in that direction. The aim of Daun's plan was to trap the Prussians on the western side of Schwarzenwasser and force the surrender of the whole army with its king. After moving out of their camp, the Prussians halted for the remainder of the night on the high ground on the east of Lechnik. The focus of the Prussian position was on the Rydberg Hill, overlooking the Patten. Meanwhile, the Austrians were on the move. Loudon crossed the Kotzebue and was advancing west along the Lechnik road. Austrian light troops were demonstrating from the far side of the Kotzebue in the area of Lechnik with the aim of diverting the Prussians from Daun's powerful force approaching from the Daunu, where it was crossing the Kotzebue. Lacy was approaching with his force from Archnov to the north of Lechnik. Due to the Prussian move, Loudon's force was forced to make contact. Major Heinert of the Zeiten Hussars, the Prussian cavalry, was patrolling the road in advance of the Prussian march to the east when he encountered Loudon's force marching down the road towards him. It was not yet dawn yet. Hunt rode hard to the Prussian encampment and found the king. Frederick asked, "What is going on?" Hunt said, "As God is my witness, the enemy is here." Frederick called his horse and began the task of organizing his army in the face of this unexpected assault. The Prussian deployment began at around 3 a.m. General Zieten was given the task of holding the ground above the Schwarzwasser and Lechnik facing west against Daun with a substantial portion of the army, while Frederick was to fight off Loudon. It had been expected that Daun would attack across the Schwarzwasser with a substantial number of men, and so Zieten's force comprised around 2/3 of the Prussian army. Preparing to face the swiftly advancing Austrians, commanded by Loudon, Frederick positioned the battery of a 12-pounder gun on the Rydberg, with the infantry holding each flank of the hill. Both sides were taken by surprise to encounter the enemy at this point in the battle. Frederick did not expect any Austrians to have circled round and come up in his rear. Loudon believed that the Prussians were still in their camp on the far side of the Schwarzwasser. But Loudon was not the sort of general to shirk a battle, particularly once it had been joined. The Prussians were still forming their line when Loudon's right-hand column, comprising a powerful cavalry, force charged Frederick's left near the village of Heimlen. Initially successful against Zieten's hussars and the Kruklik dragoons, the Austrians were driven back by the charge of Prussian cuirassiers and the infantry regiment at Alt-Bunberg. Near the bank of Kotzebue, the Austrian infantry attacked up the Rydberg and along the Lechnik road. The fire of the 12-pounder battery and the Prussian infantry brought the Austrians to a halt, and the savage counterattack along the Prussian lines drove the Austrians down the hill and back through Paten. While their infantry fell back, the Austrian cavalry charged the Prussians and inflicted heavy casualties on a number of regiments before drawing off and recrossing the Kotzebue to the south bank. Although clearly defeated, Loudon extracted his forces in good order. The victory at Lechnik had been a much-needed victory for the Prussian troops. Meanwhile, on the western front of the war, the French had desperately tried to move a large number of troops under the command of Duke de Broglie to make an attack on the Duke of Ferdinand's forces in Hessen-Kassel. Ferdinand's joint Hanoverian, British, and Prussian troops were forced to retreat until they stayed at a town called Warburg, where, on July 31st, they would defeat a small French force sent to move them. If this was only a distraction, the Duc de Broglie would move further east and move into west of Hanover. This would force Ferdinand to make a retreat back to confront the troops under Bergelieu. In London, the British Parliament mulled over whether or not to make a separate peace with the French and Habsburg forces. With their objectives in North America, India, and Hanover all but complete, many members of Parliament questioned whether or not to continue supporting their Prussian ally in the European war. Devastating result on the battle on the Plains of Abraham, as well as the inability to land troops on the coast, meant that the war in North America was all but over. In 1760, General Amherst, came up with another three-part plan to complete the invasion of Canada. He decided to send 3 separate armies toward Montreal from different directions: west up the St. Lawrence from Quebec, north across the Lake Champlain, and east across Lake Ontario. Amherst hoped that all these armies would converge on the city at the same time, trapping the French troops and forcing them to surrender. He led his force, which consisted of about 12,000 men, including 1,000 Iroquois warriors, to Montreal from Lake Ontario. As planned, the 3 armies reached Montreal by early September, and the city surrendered on September 8th. The English now controlled Canada, as well as the Ohio Country, and the British Navy ruled the seas. France had lost any control over the North American continent, a place of which we had been very influential for the last century. The war in North America was all but over, and the British had won. By October 1760, King George was blind in one eye and hard of hearing in one of his ears. On the morning of October 25th, he rose as usual at 6 a.m., drank a cup of hot chocolate, and went to close his stool alone. After a few minutes, his valet heard a loud crash and entered the room to find the king on the floor. His physician, Frank Nicholas, recorded that he appeared to have just come from his necessary stool as if going to open his excretory. The king was lifted from his bed, and Princess Amelia was sent for. Before she reached him, he was dead. At the age of nearly 77, he had lived longer than any of his English or British predecessors. A post-mortem revealed that the king had died as a result of thoracic aortic dissection. He was, of course, succeeded by his grandson, King George III, and he was buried on November 11th in Westminster Abbey. This would have major implications on the diplomatic relations regarding Hanover. The newly crowned King George III had always held little affection for the electorate of Hanover, and he had sought to make himself the Patriot King, a philosophy touted by Henry Bolingbroke. As Frederick wrote to his brother Henry after his victory at Leipzig, "Given my present situation, my only motto can be, I must conquer or die." The victory at Leipzig had been a much-needed victory for the beleaguered Prussian force. The battle between Frederick and Daun would now take place in the western Silesian hills, as well as in some parts of Saxony. King Frederick was forced to send his brother north to defend against another possible Russian attack, which was to be launched at the Prussian capital. But this time, Prince Henry was unable to cut off the Russian advance, and the Russian general Chernayev, with provocation from the French, was able to take the undefended capital of Berlin with rather ease. Chernayev's Russian force was soon reinforced by an Austrian army under the command of General Lacy. The Russians plundered the capital city of Berlin and burned down several important castles. The Austrians were more keen to exact revenge on the city because of the Prussian behavior in occupied Saxony and the Austrian territories. The Russians, represented by First Major John O'Rourke, were concerned about improving their international reputation and generally acted with greater restraint and emphasized respect towards the inhabitants. Several areas of the city were ransacked by the occupiers, and several royal palaces were burnt. Around 18,000 muskets, 143 cannons were seized. Austrian and Russian battle flags captured during fighting were retaken, and around 12,000 prisoners of war were released. Frederick was particularly worried about the paintings and books in his palace. One of his agents reported to him that the Russians had taken some, but the murals and gildings were fine, and only a few of the marble statues knocked over. The Austrians took about 130 11 and 12-year-old cadets captive from the military school and held them at Konstantinburg until the end of the war. The troops also destroyed parts of the foundry of Prussia. But a rumor that Frederick the Great was marching to rescue the capital of Berlin with his superior force prompted the commanders to withdraw from the city, as they had completed their major objectives. The occupiers withdrew from the city on October 12th, with the national contingents heading in separate directions. The Austrians under Lacy headed towards Saxony, while the Russians rejoined their main army in the vicinity of Frankfurt. Once he realized Berlin had now been abandoned by the enemy, Frederick halted his rescue mission and attempted to turn back to concentrate on Silesia and Saxony. Lacy and Daun planned to reunite their armies to increase their odds in case they were to be attacked by the King of Prussia. Frederick, of course, sensing the plan of the Austrian commanders, moved to make an attack on the Austrian defensive position at Torgau. Torgau was an important defensive position on the west bank of the Elbe. The ridge where the Austrians were positioned was highly defensible. It stretched from a point overlooking the town of Torgau on the Elbe River, running west for about 3 kilometers. Covering the area from the east of the ridge and the town of Turgaroo was a large lake called the Grosh Teak. Along the southern front of the Turgaroo Ridge ran a drainage ditch, the Rygriben, and the surrounding area of the city was heavily forested. Frederick decided upon a wide outflanking move around the Austrian right wing, an attack from the woods on the far side of the Turgaroo Ridge. A diversionary assault would be conducted by a force of 11,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, commanded by General Zayton, against the south side of the ridge and against the Austrian and Saxon troops positioned around Gross Teck. The Austrians held the Turgaroo Ridge with a line of infantry battalions and a second line supported by the strong batteries of artillery. At the eastern end of the ridge, strong forces of cavalry covered the infantry's flank. Frederick intended to lead 3 columns of Prussians through the Donschmechter wooded area to the west of the Austrian position to bring them to the rear of Daun's army. The 3 columns comprised 24,000 infantry and 6,500 cavalry. Frederick, commanding the first column of Prussian infantry, set off through the woods at 6 a.m. on November 3rd, 1760, followed by the second column, also a substantial force of infantry commanded by General Holsten. The third column, comprising the main body of the cavalry, was commanded by Prince George Ludwig von Holsten, and followed on a little late due to the commander having dawdled over his breakfast. So it is reported. At the main road to Turgaroo, General Zayton's corps turned right and marched up the road in front of Daun's positions. Frederick's 3 columns continued across the country in the wide sweep through the forests around the Austrian right flank to attack Daun's rear. Somewhere near Weidstein, around noon, Frederick's columns encountered the light troops of the Austrian General Reed. The sound of firing could be heard in the main Austrian position, and Croats came in to Daun with the news of the engagement. Daun was alerted that Frederick was marching round to his rear and began rearranging his troops into a rectangular box formation, with the front facing in each direction. By 1 p.m., Frederick reached his intended position to attack the Austrian army under Daun. After brief artillery fire, around 2 p.m., with his infantry and cavalry lagging behind, Frederick decided to launch his first attack on the Habsburg troops. The Austrian artillery began the battle with great success, killing hundreds of thousands of advancing Prussian troops. But the delayed cavalry units under the command of Holsten arrived late to the battle. But these reinforcements would do a great deal to change the tide of the ensuing battle. On the right side, a counterattack led by Daun himself was fiercely opposed by the Prussian troops. The fighting on the outer flanks of the battle was devastating. In the midst of the chaos of the battle, a musket ball struck the King of Prussia, causing him to briefly lose consciousness before being carried off the battlefield. As Frederick regained consciousness, he could see his second attack on the Austrian lines failing. At this point, Frederick commanded Holsten to lead an attack on the far left side of the battlefield. As the heavy fighting ensued, Daun became convinced that he had already achieved victory. With his cavalry charge on the right side achieving a moderate deal of success, he sent a message to Vienna telling the court of his great victory. But Holsten made a desperate cavalry charge on the right side, which achieved great success and caught the Austrians off guard. And then around 4 p.m., General Zayton now made his attack on the Austrian troops from the south. Zayton's charge was joined by Holsten, and this attack by Zayton and Holsten achieved great success on the right side of the battlefield. General Daun himself was also wounded at the battle and was forced to flee. Holstein and Zieten continued their attack. Eventually, late in the afternoon, the Austrians were forced to retreat. With their commander Daun wounded, a great deal of discipline fell in the Austrian camp. The Austrians were now forced to retreat to the Elbe, where they tried to reorganize. The Prussians had achieved a massive tactical advantage, gaining a strong foothold in Saxony. But the victory had come at a cost. The Battle of Torgau ended with both armies losing nearly 13,000 men. The difference being the nearly 8,000 Austrians that were captured by the Prussians. News of his victory at Torgau was brought to Frederick at the church of Eisenach, where he was treating his wounds. Though Frederick understood that he had won a great victory, he also understood that this was at a terrible cost to his already depleted army. Nevertheless, the victory at Torgau was a great tactical Prussian victory and kept the Prussian cause alive and well going into 1761.